Hello, AP World History students. Mr. Lassiter here. We'll go ahead and get started as soon as you guys are ready to ask your questions. This live review, we're focusing on our midterm exam, which if you are taking my class, will cover periods 1, 2, 3, and 4 because of our early start this year. We'll focus a little bit on period 4 today, and of course your questions from any of the other units. We'll also be doing another one of these on Tuesday, a live review for anybody who has any remaining questions before our midterm exam on Wednesday and Thursday. As far as what we are going to cover today, that's really up to you as usual. So as far as how much time we're going to be spending on this, that's really dependent on what your questions are. It could be a real short review tonight. It might be a little bit longer. Yeah, we'll just kind of see what you're in for. On our midterm, of course, I've already kind of gone over some of that stuff in class. I'll direct you to some of our Google Classroom materials for review. There are also a lot of review videos on my channel that look at the key concepts for units 1, 2, 3, and 4, as well as 5 and 6, but focusing on those review videos, if you want to take a look at those will certainly be helpful. There's going to be required watching for the end of the year anyways. Still waiting on my Coke Zero sponsorship deal. One day it will come. Anyways, I'll go ahead and take a peek at some of these questions as they start. All right, if you have any, we'll get started. The first thing I will review and think about as the questions kind of start to come in is thinking about what this exam covers and just what the AP exam covers, right? And the first thing to think about is periodization. I think they've kind of removed that skill itself from the test. We even used to have a periodization essay. But just keep in mind the time periods when things happen and the trends in those time periods. Unit 1 is everything before 600 BCE. That is our ancient world. It is designed to think about that movement from hunting and gathering to farming, the development of the first agricultural communities, the first city-states, and then some very early smaller empires, especially in our river valley civilizations. Unit 2, the classical era, is where really when we see that age of empires, so to speak, where we see like Rome and Han China develop and the Mauryan and Gupta empires of India, etc. And then and we see some, of course, trans-regional trade pick up in that second time period, that classical age. See really the development of the Silk Roads, a more substantial Indian Ocean trade network. Of course, the Mediterranean network was very important in that time period. Time period 3, which is our last unit, we see an intensification of those trans-regional networks, whether it's kind of the height of the Silk Road under the Mongols or an intensification in the Indian Ocean region. We really see kind of intensification everywhere. We see those post-classical empires, some that are reconstituted, like the Byzantine and eventually the Tang dynasty following the Sui, which is right at the end of that classical era. And we also see some new styles of governments, right? The caliphates, the Mongol khanates. And so those are the things that really define time period 3. And of course, time period 4, which we're studying now, is all about the beginning of that global era, global maritime empires starting to develop, whether it's the trading post empires of Portugal or the transatlantic trade that comes about with the Spanish establishing an empire in the Americas, or the British or the French or even the Dutch establishing colonies in that first phase of imperialism. So Unit 4 is, of course, defined by that rise of global trade, and certainly it has a lot of political, social, and economic effects. So that's our course so far in, I don't know, a couple minutes. So we'll get to your questions now and think about those. So the first question is coming from Abby about the Empire of Russia from 1450 to 1750. And I figured I would get this question. So I've prepared a little bit for it to think about what's going on in Russia in this early modern period. But to give a little bit more background, we have to think about the beginnings of Russia, right? So we have to consider exactly this is a midterm review after all. So let's think about the history of Russia and generally what it looked like. Sorry, I'm making noise with my microphone here. The first thing to think about is the foundations of Russia, and that is like in Kievan Rus, that region that is now really the Ukraine. General things to understand is that these are likely Viking settlers in this region, mixing with kind of Slavic peoples, forming this Kievan Rus identity. And so we kind of start to see these kind of powerful trading cities, really trading mostly with the Byzantine Empire. We see, of course, Orthodox Christianity spread to Kievan Rus. We see Kievan Rus trade mostly to the south, although some of the northern cities, Novgorod example, is part of the Hanseatic League. What that means for Russia is that because of that kind of more eastern connection, they are going to develop quite differently than the rest of Europe, what we consider to be maybe Western Europe and the way that would develop. Now, Russia is also affected greatly, of course, in these kind of powerful city principalities, regions, by the Mongol invasions. And if you remember, the Mongols come in and they destroy Kiev, because Kiev, of course, did not want the Mongols to come in, and that's a bad idea to oppose the Mongols. And so we see the center of power in Russia shift from Kiev and kind of Novgorod, these trade cities, to Moscow. Moscow was basically a principality in Russia that deals with the Mongols. They go along with them, decide to help them out, basically paying tribute to the Mongols for as long as the Golden Horde is in charge. And by doing so, the city of Moscow really vaults to the front of, I would say, I guess, of power in what is known as Russia. All right, so that brings us to our sort of like time period 4, right? This era that we're studying right now. And the at the beginning of this time period, the Mongols are basically kicked out of Russia. These princes refuse to pay tribute to the Mongols. They declare them free of Mongol rule. That happens under a guy named Ivan III. Eventually, his grandson established absolute rule in Russia. His grandson was Ivan IV. And Ivan IV was the one that you know as Ivan the Terrible. So extremely powerful leader, unites Russia together really under his power and begins its expansion. And this is where we're going to see Russia go from maybe just what we might consider like a kingdom in this region of Eastern Europe to an empire, a land-based empire at that. So he expands it eastward. He recruits peasants and offers, basically makes offers of freedom from their feudal lords if they agree to go out and settle lands in the east. Of course, those lands eventually will help Russia expand. This is one of the things we talk about with like the intensification of peasant agriculture in Russia. Anyways, Ivan IV, being like Ivan the Terrible, so to speak, takes on this title of Tsar, right? Like the Caesar, the absolute ruler of Russia. He is oftentimes kind of looked at as, I guess, I don't know what we call it. I mean, he was a powerful leader, but he was also someone who was pretty much ruthless, right? He's going to rule over what we might consider to be like a reign of terror. Anybody who was like a threat to his power, he would take down. And anyway, so he really kind of cements Russia as this centralized place. I probably dwelled too long on him. Anyways, when he dies, there's really no like set ruler of Russia, and so there's going to be kind of a time period of trouble, so to speak, in Russia, and eventually, out of that, a new leader is elected czar by the feudal lords. So basically, these feudal lords get together, and they create. They choose kind of one of them to be in charge. That guy is a Romanov. And this is the beginning of the Romanov dynasty of Russia, which will rule over Russia from about 1600-ish until the Russian Empire, until the Russian Revolution in 1917, when the Romanovs are done away with. So the Romanovs consolidate power even more so. They often rule ruthlessly as well. The peasants who end up settling in these regions eventually just basically become like slaves, or they were serfs, but practically slaves. And they continued to expand the empire. They expand their empire eastward toward Siberia. They expanded into Ukraine. That's generally kind of the trend we see of Russia in this time period, is that expansion and the settlement of land. The only other person I would say that is significant to really think of, well, there's really two, but one kind of comes a little bit after this time period. Other than really like Ivan the Terrible, or Ivan the Fourth, you should know certainly who Peter the Great is. So Peter the Great rules Russia at the very end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century. And he comes to power. And at this point, like, if people were to ask you, was Russia Asian or European, people would have probably categorized it as Eastern, as Asian, perhaps, very much different from Europe. Russia, in that sense, was, if you like look at pictures of Russia before Peter the Great comes to power, they're all like in these big scraggly beards, like these gigantic fur coats, really just kind of looking like backwoods fur traders, so to speak. Peter the Great changes all that. I used to do a weird history on, I don't know if we did it last year, this idea that he wants to westernize Russia. He's like this kind of oddball character, do everything kind of guy. He like wanders like around Europe, just like basically partying and learning like how to build ships like in dockyards, and then is very much interested in Western style learning. He comes back to Russia eventually when his sister tries to like take over in a power grab, and he, in taking over, decides to implement a westernization program. So requiring people to dress in Western style clothing. He orders a navy be built. He eventually establishes the city of St. Petersburg as his like Western style capital, where he builds the Winter Palace. This is like a port city to connect with the rest of Europe through trade. Built again, brings in like European engineers and scientists and architects to make this very like Western European city. He requires that all the nobles shave their beards, and if they don't, he does it for them, right? Of course, there's still intense serfdom that exists in Russia at that time, but Peter the Great, nevertheless known as kind of the westernizer of Rome, he really takes this very Eastern, like land-based empire, and brings it into that Western realm, makes it something that the rest of Europe is going to have to reckon with, right? Now, Peter the Great, like those before him, had undergone expansion policies. At the really the last ruler that comes up in this time period, she's actually in the next time period, and that is Catherine the Great. She rules it in the second half of the 18th century, and she, of course, continues to enforce serfdom in Russia. That's going to last for quite some time, but she also uh, expands Russian territory. Her big thing is gaining warm water ports. So there's an aggressive territorial expansion, gaining regions of Poland, territory on the Black Sea, making sure that Russia had access to the Mediterranean. So that's kind of what we see in Russia. Peter, of course, and Catherine is responsible a great deal for the westernization of Russia. Of course, another thing that is important to think about in terms of, in addition to these political transformations of Russia in this time period, are that reliance on serfdom, basically coerced labor in Russia as it becomes much more important. So they say an intensification of peasant agriculture and the increased use of serfdom. So that is Russia in a nutshell, so to speak. So hopefully I didn't drone on too long. Yeah, take a look at your video if you need more on Russia. Can I review Indian Ocean trade during period 4? I most certainly can. In general, know that in the trade in the Indian Ocean is a continuity, right? If we think in terms of continuity and change, right, in this unit, we want to think about how things stayed the same in the Indian Ocean. Well, first of all, for the most part, there's still going to be a lot of players in Indian Ocean trade in this time period, right? In terms of thinking about who's involved, right? You're going to have lots of different regions, whether it's in East Africa or the Middle East, Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, China. Those are all going to be people who whose goods are flowing through the Indian Ocean. Now, that being said, and keeping in mind that many of the goods stay the same, right? Spices, silk, slaves and ivory and gold from Africa, what have you. Those things will remain fairly the same, right? But the big change in the Indian Ocean in time period 4 is the involvement of Europeans. In 1488, the Portuguese sight the Indian Ocean, but in 1498, they actually reach India. And that's going to be that major turning point in the Indian Ocean. And that is European involvement. You have to think about the technology that makes that possible, whether it's new map-making techniques, the astrolabe, compass, caravel ships, which allow Europeans to sail through the Atlantic into the Indian Ocean. Those certainly will become important. Of course, as European merchants enter the Indian Ocean, they are going to become the middlemen of trade there, especially as they grow more powerful. The Portuguese building their trading post colonies, eventually the Dutch and the British kind of competing for a share of that global trade. The joint stock companies that they developed, the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, are, of course, extremely important in that trade. Overall, though, it is just generally a continuation of what happens. There is an intensification of trade in the Indian Ocean because of European involvement, and also because of the influx of silver into the Indian Ocean, right? You can't forget that Europeans, especially the Spanish, are mining silver in the Americas, and ultimately that silver is going to find its way into places like China. So that's the big stuff, I would say, with trade in the Indian Ocean. As far as thinking of change and continuity, I'm trying to think if there's anything else off the top of my head. I'm kind of scrolling through some different notes and things to see if I'm missing anything. But that is what I would say. Oh, of course, connecting the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic system will be bring, of course, a lot of goods from the Americas other than silver into the Indian Ocean, which, of course, has massive demographic effects in the rise of population in China, for example. So that's something to keep in mind. Other than that, yeah, I think that's a pretty quick overview of Indian Ocean trade. What effects on European Asian trade did growing Mongol influence have over the Silk Road? Okay, so this is jumping back to time period 3. So I want to make sure I'm answering the question that we have here. What effects on European or Asian trade did the growing Mongol influence have over the Silk Road? So I think this is aimed at, thinking about how the Mongols impact trade just in general, right? And of course, by connecting pretty much the entirety of the Silk Road under Mongol control, what we have is a single empire in charge of a trade network. That helps for efficiency in trade, like first and foremost. You don't have to abide by different states' trade regulations or rules. The Mongols enacted a single set of laws through its law code, the Yassa, Yassa, that allowed that was really favorable toward trade. Remember, the Mongols themselves are nomadic people who engage in trade quite a bit, and so they're going to facilitate this trade through their law code. They also do so through trying to improve communication across the Mongol Empire. They do that with arrow messengers. They issue passports to merchants and traders to give them safe passage from one end to the other. So what that ends up doing, if we think in terms of that European-Asian connection, it brings them much closer, right, in terms of goods flowing back and forth. Those goods that were maybe created in China or India make it to the West much more efficiently, and thus more goods are traded, right? So it's like that feedback loop that we see. So that would be like its biggest influence. It's just that intensification. I keep using that word, but that's a good one. That intensification of trade in this time period, or in time period 3. Some would say, of course, that intensification of trade in time period 3 causes Europeans to start looking eastward much more so, which really might be seen as a cause, perhaps, of European exploration in time period 4. Among other things, once the Mongols are defeated in the Middle East, that gives rise to the Ottomans, and the Portuguese and Spanish do not want to do business with that Muslim empire after the fall of Byzantium or Constantinople. And so they start looking for other ways to access those Asian markets, right? So that could be we connect the dots there. Yeah, so that would be the big effects that I would see off the top of my head. I did forget to mention something with the Indian Ocean trade in period 4, which I'll go back to just for a moment to say that while the Indian Ocean trade is the preeminent trade network at the beginning of time period 4, around 1450, by the end of that time period, it will be surpassed by the Atlantic network, which develops in time period 4 and will continue to grow in time period 5. All right, question about the Dark Ages in Europe. Can I review those? Certainly, I will give kind of a good brief overview of those Dark Ages. Now, first of all, I'll take issue with the term Dark Ages to start with. When we use the term kind of dark with that to really emphasize the isolation of Europe, and in this time period 3, of course, as we were talking the last time period, Mongol trade, the Crusades, those will be things that bring Europeans out of the quote unquote Dark Ages. Thinking about this, another effect the Silk Road has, of course, on Europe is the trade of disease, which will be seen in the late Middle Ages. It kind of signifies the change from the High to the late Middle Ages. Anyways, the Middle Ages in Europe, really, we take from the fall of Rome in about the year 500 until about 1500, right, when the Renaissance is in full swing. That's what we tend to consider our Middle Ages, right? So keeping that in mind, when we think about the Middle Ages, we really break it down kind of into 3 time periods. So it's breaking down the Dark Age, what do you want to call them? Into the early Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, and the Late Middle Ages. And so for um, the early Middle Ages, it is defined by the beginning of feudalism, but also a brief period of time where Europe is dealing with not just invasions, but also with the rise of Charlemagne, whose empire, the Frankish Empire, breaks up rather quickly. So that's kind of like an aberration. But for the most part, we see invasions from the Arabs through the Iberian Peninsula, the Vikings from the north in Scandinavia, and then the Magyars from the east, from Asia, basically. And so if we think about those things, it's going to lead those invasions are going to lead to isolation in Europe, people kind of withdrawing, looking for protection from feudal lords. People will be bound to the land in serfdom, owing service to these feudal lords in exchange for protection. And so what we end up seeing are these really fragmented, decentralized kingdoms in Europe. Now, those kingdoms will remain until really time period 4, when we start to see general centralization. The High Middle Ages, though, once those invasions begin to subside, once we see kind of an end of those, we will see Europe start to recover a little bit. They will be engaging in well, first the Crusades in about the year 1100, but that leads to greater expansion of trade between Europe and the Middle East. Europe starting to rediscover ideas, starting to become less and less isolated. It'll lead to the regrowth of urban areas in this time, or urban revival, we might say. As there's more safe and reliable transport, the rise of commerce. There's going to be even like a general rise in temperatures, which helps to increase agricultural productivity, increases population. There can be new, for example, in these High Middle Ages, like new agricultural techniques that go along with that to increase population. And that goes on really pretty well. Like, right, the Mongols are in charge of the Silk Roads during the, around the year 1200, 1300, and that's going to increase trade even more with Europe. And then the Black Plague hits, the Black Death, the bubonic plague. And of course that it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, right? You don't have these invasions necessarily, but you have disease. You have the Little Ice Age set in, which will lead to a decline in agricultural productivity. Besides the fact that you just don't have the people to farm, as somewhere between like 1/3 and 1/2 of Europeans succumb to these diseases, or this disease. And so that's kind of a step back for Europe. However, trade, especially with Italian city-states, will continue to happen with the Middle East, and eventually the Renaissance will come about and start to pull Europe out of that funk, if you want to say, out of the kind of nadir, that low point that comes with the Black Death. That's the Dark Ages, so to speak. The Late Middle Ages, we see a little bit. Of course, we see the Renaissance beginning, greater centralization, the Age of Exploration, eventually leading to growing wealth, which helps to further centralize in medieval Europe, or the end of the medieval Europe era. And and then we get into the Protestant Reformation, which is just a whole other thing for, of course, time period 4. That was a lot. It's really, really tough to summarize that in such a short period of time. So I hope you were able to follow. But I will say, outside of Charlemagne, perhaps things to keep in mind with the Middle Ages is, of course, the social political structure, decentralization, feudal system, all of that. Charlemagne is kind of one of the major players, I would say, to remember um, in feudal Europe. But and then also understand kind of the power of the church. The Catholic Church is really what is that unifying force for Europe, given the lack of political unity in the region. Of course, that means that you're going to have a um, a power struggle, so to speak, between secular rulers and church leaders in Europe, and that really will not be resolved until after fully until after the Protestant Reformation, and eventually after the wars of religion, the 30-Year War, etc., um, and the Peace of Westphalia, where basically they decide, hey, we've been fighting each other over religion for a long time. What if everybody just decides whether they want to be Catholic or Protestant? And that nice little compromise helps us move past some of those problems. All right. Oh, more about camels. Kathleen Reed. I can certainly tell you a great deal about them if you would like. We've talked a lot about camels, but I'll just regale you with some of my favorite camel facts, including the fact that they are democratic in choosing what direction they want to travel. Really, of course, in this time period, or in what we've studied so far, we see camels as like an important mode of transportation and trade. So keep in mind that they're going to be used extensively in the Arabian trade network, along the Silk Roads, and of course the Trans-Saharan network. And we got to give thanks to that camel saddle for all those things. All right, next, can we go over the Black Death implications of the whole world rather than just in Europe? The whole world. Well, I think it's important, yes. Thinking about the impact of the Black Death, it is not only in Europe that it affects. It certainly affects people all along the Silk Road, starting in Asia. And if we think about so we see those effects in Asia just like in Europe. I do not expect you to get many questions on the AP exam outside of Europe with the Black Death. Perhaps maybe some discussions of how diseases pass along trade routes. That might be something that you might see. If you're looking for something kind of more specifically, let me know in the questions, and I will try to provide a better answer than that. All right, just lost our place. Why are gamers the most oppressed class? I don't know. That's I would disagree probably. Types of coerced labor. So this is a really good question. It's something you will most definitely see on your midterms. Certainly on the AP exam, we tend to think about what is it? Theme number 3, I think, is economic systems, right? And labor is one of the major factors here. So in Unit 4, we think about new forms of social organization, new modes of production, and in time period 4, there is a global demand that is just ever rising for raw materials and finished goods. And that's as a result of growing populations following the Columbian Exchange, an increase in trade in general. And we have, of course, an increase in peasant labor, which isn't always coerced, right? This is kind of free peasant labor. We see, as we talked about with Russia, settlement of eastern parts of Russia. We see increase in cotton production in India, and increase in silk production in China. But we also see a rise in this time period of coerced labor. And that is probably like the biggest change with labor that you're going to see in this course, is this like extreme rise of coerced labor in this early modern period from 1450 to 1750. That coincides with the growing of cash crops, especially in the Americas, the production of raw materials, the mining of silver, etc. So The major types of labor that you need to know in this time period include indentured servitude, which was a system of labor in which a person would basically sign up to be indebted to someone in order to get passage to the new world, usually. So you would learn a skill, perhaps once you reach the end of your term of labor, which was somewhere between 5 and 7 years typically. You would have paid off your debt for the travel. You may have learned a skill. You might be gifted land or something um, that would have been paid for by the person who is in charge, kind of holds your indentures, your papers. But that was also a system that was pretty harsh. There were a lot of people who like ran away, so to speak, from indentured servitude and tried to get out of these contracts. Oftentimes they were treated quite harshly. Oftentimes they were working in very difficult conditions. We see indentured servitude be used in the Caribbean for some time in the production of sugarcane, which was extremely brutal and just simply wasn't effective. So we will see by the end of this time period a decline in indentured servitude. At just about the same time, we're seeing a massive increase in the use of slaves imported from Africa. And so we have chattel slavery in this time period where people are personal property. They can be bought and sold like any goods. And this is kind of what we tend to think of in our minds of when we think about slavery. This was generational slavery. So it was hereditary. If your mother was a slave, you were a slave. The slavery, of course, was quite harsh. Millions of people brought over, extremely high mortality rates in the transatlantic slave trade, and extremely high mortality rates in the places where slaves are brought, primarily to Brazil and the Caribbean, but also to North America. Just absolute brutal conditions, especially on these plantations where they were working. Of course, chattel slavery, which we tend to think about in the Americas, and the growth of that in the Americas to grow cash crops is something we think of as a major change in time period 4 from 1450 to 1750. There is, of course, the continuity of slavery in the old world, so to speak. Slavery does continue. There is still going to be a trans-Saharan slave trade, still an Indian Ocean slave trade where slaves are traded out of sub-Saharan Africa to other places. And so this is not something that comes out of nowhere, but it is something that, of course, like most other things in this time period, in time period 4, intensifies, right? Some other types of coerced labor that we think about in at least the European colonies are the Spanish use of the Inca Mita system. The Mita system was used by the Inca as kind of labor as a tax, kind of a corvée system of labor, where people would give a certain amount of their time during the year to the government. When the Spanish come in, they use basically this infrastructure, but primarily for mining. Mining silver, especially in Bolivia, Potosi, right? And of course, extremely brutal conditions. The Spanish also use a system of labor they bring over from Spain called the encomienda system, where a Spaniard who conquers territory for the country of Spain would be given a set of land, and basically was the people who lived on that land, the locals would be entrusted to them, but basically as slaves, as long as they were taught in the Spanish way, maybe taught Catholicism or what have you, by these leaders. That did not quite happen as much as just absolutely brutal treatment. And Spain eventually outlaws the encomienda system, and it's replaced with the hacienda system, basically a plantation system. Beyond that, I've already talked about thinking outside of the Americas. I've talked about the intensification of serfdom in Russia at around the same time that serfdom is on the decline in Europe, especially starting with the Black Death. We see that people in Europe can start demanding wages for their labor, and so serfdom and that system of serfdom starts to fall apart in Western Europe. That is not going to be the case in Russia. So that's the rundown of coerced labor. So hopefully it's good. All right. Will it be question of the characteristics of classical Greek democracy or something similar along those lines? So the I don't know if we'll see something. I mean, it's tough to say. The exam I'll be using, I haven't. We'll be using a secure exam for our class, and so I don't know exactly what the questions are on Greece, if there are any. What I will say is, thinking about Greece, there's maybe a few things to keep in mind, which is that when we think about Greek culture and its maybe contributions to the West, we think about Greek philosophy. Important philosophers such as Plato or Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, these kind of founders of Western philosophy. Certainly, Greco-Roman philosophy and science are going to become very important, very formative for the rest of Western culture. They deal with kind of a range of topics. The Greek city-states themselves, I would say, might come up, knowing that Athens developed democracy is probably pretty important. That Sparta was an oligarchy might come up on the AP exam. But in the AP World course, oftentimes we just think about the Greek role, how Greeks interacts with people around it. So Persia, the Greco-Persian Wars, for example, as Persia attacks Greece twice, failing to conquer Greece. Athens and Sparta kind of rise up as this rivalry in Greece with their two kind of systems. The Athenians have the Delian League or the Athenian Empire. The Spartans have the Peloponnesian League. And eventually they go to war with each other in the Peloponnesian Wars. And they're all conquered by Alexander the Great eventually, because these city-states through these wars are kind of permanently weakened. And Alexander the Great spreads that Greek culture, that Western, what we might consider like the foundation of Western culture, across his empire. And we start to see syncretic blends of Greek and Indian culture, or Greek and Persian culture, or Greek and Egyptian culture. So those are the things when I think about Greece in the classical era, which was its time period too. Those are the things that come to my mind. Not necessarily like great specifics about how was democracy carried out, right? That would be stuff that might be beyond a survey course like this. Yeah, that's like a course I took in college. We don't get that deep in it. I'm not going to ask you like about like the Greek voting process. All right, moving on. The characteristics of the split between Sunni and Shia Muslims after the time period. So the Sunni-Shia split, we're kind of jumping into time period 3 here. Islam comes about around the year 600 CE, of course, and the death of the Prophet Muhammad comes as kind of a surprise. There's no real set succession to like the leadership in the Islamic community. What Muslims knew is that there was not going to be any more prophets. They knew that Muhammad was the final prophet, so what we have are like these successors come about, the caliphs, these caliphs, the successors to the Prophet Muhammad, and ultimately, we see the development of what is called the Rashidun Caliphate, the rightly guided ones, and I believe it's like Abu Bakr is the first, followed by like Omar, and then Uthman is the third caliph, and Uthman is killed. He's murdered, and there is kind of great suspicion that Ali, who was I believe like the nephew of the Prophet Muhammad, one of his first followers, may have had something to do with it. Or the people who believed that he was the right caliph had something to do with it, because there was certainly this idea that he had been passed over as caliph. He does eventually become the fourth caliph before dying himself, and then the Umayyad Caliphate being established. But ultimately, what you have are these two groups of Muslims: these Sunni Muslims who believe that yes, he was the fourth caliph, and there were three before him, and then these Shia Muslims who believe that Ali was actually the who should have been the true successor of Muhammad, right? And ultimately, this leads, this first kind of Muslim civil war that develops over these, the succession to Muhammad, ultimately resulting in the Umayyad Caliphate coming to power. This kind of starts a split early on in Islam between Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims. But that split between Sunni and Shia Muslims really doesn't intensify until much later on, when we see rivalries within the Islamic world. For example, between the Ottomans and the Safavids. Like we see in time period 4, these rivalries that develop intensify that split. Even today, the Safavid Empire is based out of Iran. And of course, today, Iran is a majority Shia nation. So that's rather important if we think about these state rivalries that we see develop in this time, in our course in time period 4, especially, is the Ottoman Safavid rivalry. So that's what we see, kind of maybe an intensification over time, one that perhaps wasn't quite as great or as exaggerated early on, but that split does begin early, and a lot of Muslims say that split kind of ends that golden age of Islam early on. So yeah, that's pretty much it. A question about the Hanseatic League. Great. So the Hanseatic League is out of time period 3. Again, I'm trying to since we're jumping around for a midterm review, I just want to kind of firmly plan it in your head at a certain time. So the Hanseatic League is a network, a trade network that develops in Northern Europe. It was vital in connecting European merchants together, and it is developed between trading cities, basically of the North and Baltic seas, basically. So Novgorod in Russia, I think even like London is a member of this Hanseatic League, and some other like Northern European cities and in Scandinavia, etc. I think like Hamburg and Danzig and stuff are a part of this Hanseatic League. But ultimately, what we see out of this Hanseatic League is a pretty good example of states facilitating commercial projects, right? States facilitating trade. In this case, the Hanseatic League in our around like the 14th century or so, in Europe. So that I'm going to pull up the key concept to see if I can get this worded correctly, because you may see this wording in questions on your test, and it's always good to know generally the language of the key concepts. You don't have to memorize these key concepts, of course, but it is important maybe to recognize the language. So the key concept reads that commercial growth or commercial practices led to an increase in the volume of trade and expanded the geographic range of existing and newly active trade networks. And then the subpart of that is commercial growth was facilitated by state practices, including trading organizations such as the Hanseatic League. So this trade organization, known as the Hanseatic League, Um, was kind of this agreement between these cities to trade between each other, but it also set up court systems to settle trade disputes. It had its own military force, like its own navy, to protect any of its members if there was anything that was kind of uh, was unseemly, or people weren't obeying trade rules or regulations or what have you. So now what this hanseatically does is it connects kind of wide ranges of Northern Europe to Russia, and then ultimately through trade into the Byzantine area, the Black Sea, connecting it with Eastern Europe and the Middle East, and further on down the Silk Roads. So important trade network, of course, for Northern Europe, but also connecting it outside of that region. Again, examples of states facilitating commercial practices, in this case, a trade organization doing that. All right. There might be a little more to that, but it's not coming in my head right now. Certainly, I might be able to think of some later, and I'll probably come back to it. Let's see. Go to the next question here. Looking for. I lost my place here. Okay. Oh, somebody asked about the reason I asked about Black Death was because the DBQ topic involved the Black Death, if it's spread. Okay. Well, I hope I helped you on that, but I hope it wasn't impermissible help from your for your teacher. Were there any negative impacts in Europe from the discovering of the New World? Good question. Other than syphilis, negative impacts in Europe of the discovering of the New World. Using the term negative there might be, it leaves it open to some maybe subjectivity. And so looking at it subjectively, perhaps, you might say that the influx of money that comes out of the New World funds certainly like centralization of governments, and ultimately helps to fund like larger private armies that are beholden to kings of Europe as they centralize their power. So perhaps like an increase in warfare if you connected the dots a little too much. Most of the negative effects of this Columbian exchange, its arrival in the Americas, of Europeans in the Americas, most of the negative effects will be felt by people in the Americas or people in West Africa, at least in time period 4. Of course, there will be plenty of negative effects continuing in our next time period. But yeah, so I would say it's tough to say how many, like what the negative effects on Europe are, because in many parts they come out ahead. But you might say perhaps the money funds wars that eventually come to Europe, and then of course syphilis, which I've already mentioned. All right, I am a lot of people debating other YouTubers on this channel who will remain nameless, and I will not mention their names. I'm trying to see if there's any. I may have disregarded a question, so if I did, just ask it again. So let's see. Next question is about the silver trade, perhaps, but I've lost my place. It's really hard to keep up with this chat. Are there any good outcomes of this silver trade in Europe? Well, yes, I would say. I mean, Europe, silver is the currency, the first really global currency that we see in the world. And it comes about in this time period where global trade begins. The Spanish peso de ocho is going to be accepted around the world. It's even accepted as like currency in the United States until the 1800s. Spanish currency being accepted kind of in the early years of the U.S. So for Spain, you know, they spend all their money elsewhere. They pay other countries to do things for them, and maybe they don't invest as much in their own infrastructure. And that might be why Spain kind of goes by the wayside while other countries learn to industrialize and become major factors in trade in the Indian Ocean and around the world. But certainly it gave Europe the wealth needed to engage in worldwide trade. And yeah, so I would say that would be the good outcome of the silver trade in Europe. Again, Europe gets kind of the better end of that deal, so to speak. All right, thinking about early civilizations, what was the most common political significance of conflict between states and rulers of earlier civilizations? All right, so I think I know generally where this question is going. Thinking about what caused common conflict, right, between states and empires in the early course. Really, it comes down to resources. Any empire, right? Anytime you have an empire be created, or even a state, right? It's all about controlling resources, which of course results in power. And those resources could be land, or it could be iron, or it could be silver, it could be whatever it might be, trade over a trade network. So you're looking for resources, and even early on, whether it's the Romans controlling the entirety of the Mediterranean, or to control trade throughout that whole region, or whether it was the Mongols conquering the Silk Road in order to control trade, or whether or not it was China expanding to the south to gain access to more resources, or that's really what it comes down to. I would say. That's about as simple as I can put it. Of course, there are other things, and there are crazy stories about people being upset at somebody else and so wanting to invade them, but those don't come up quite as much in the course. Do you need to know specific trade items? I would say yes, but you don't have to go overboard with trade items. You may want to think in terms of what is traded throughout our time periods. Think in terms of what maybe is mentioned in the key concepts. If you go through the key concepts, Freemanpedia usually has pretty good reviews or maps that show items that are traded back and forth. So we can go through some trade networks and just kind of brainstorm, because for the most part, the items that are traded are going to be continuities across time periods. So anytime it's a maritime network, it's over water, you're going to be seeing heavier bulk items. And if it is over land, it's land-based, you're going to be seeing items that are of a higher value to low weight ratios. So things that may not weigh very much and are easy to transport from one place to another and have a great deal of value with them. In the Mediterranean, for example, right, we're going to see things like olive oil and timber and wine and those types of things be traded, because they are bulk items that are very difficult to carry over land. Whereas the Trans-Saharan network, which will be connecting West Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean, you're going to be trading in gold, slaves, and ivory, things that are a little bit easier to transport and that are worth a great deal. In exchange, salt will move south into Sub-Saharan Africa. In the Indian Ocean, yes, you'll have some of those things that are traded over land, but you're going to have spices, you're going to have later on porcelain, you're going to have silk, cotton, those types of things traded in the Indian Ocean, as well as goods moving out of Sub-Saharan Africa, gold, ivory, slaves. On the Silk Roads, you're going to see a lot of high value goods, right? Gems or silk, high value spices, those types of things will be traded across the Silk Road. So I would say those are things to consider. Of course, a lot more things move with them. That's just thinking about commodities, but ideas, religions, all of those things move as well. All right. Let's see. I think I'm caught up with questions on the stream. So if I've missed your question, go ahead and type it again. I see one coming through, a couple of them coming through now. So I'll be on maybe for about 10 more minutes to answer the next few questions that come through. First question here, what caused the decline of trade on the Silk Road? Really good question, but it also depends what time period you're talking about. In general, trade declines on trade networks whenever we have empires enter decline. So the Silk Road gets going in the classical era. You can think about it when you have the Romans and the Parthians and the Mauryan and Gupta empires of India and the Han dynasty of China, right? Those are, when all of those empires are doing their thing, there's a lot of trade going back and forth on the Silk Road. When does that just start to decline? Well, at the end of the classical era, when you have the decline of Rome and the decline of Han China, and the Mauryan Empire has declined and the Parthian Empire starts to fall, trade will become disrupted on different regions of the Silk Road. Does that mean it stops completely? Certainly not. Trade does continue, but at a much less efficiently, and thus kind of we see a lot less of it. When the Islamic caliphates are on the rise and the Tang dynasty is on the rise, we'll see a revival of trade on the Silk Road. That'll be carried through with the Mongols. And then when the Mongol Empire collapses, a slight period of decline during that until those empires are kind of reconstituted, reestablished. But the Silk Road trade will never be at the same height it was really on the Mongols. There is some intensification of trade just because there's an intensification of all trade in the post-classical or in the early modern era, but the Silk Road's never going to really relive those glory days. There's a lot of really interesting readings that you might be able to find online now about another, like a reemergence of the Silk Road in the modern time period as China starts to construct and pay for roads cutting across Asia and many different countries in Asia, kind of a modern Silk Road. So it's kind of cool to think about those trade networks still in existence, right? People are still trading throughout the Indian Ocean. People are still trading globally. So kind of cool to consider the fact that maybe it never fully declined. Do we need to know specifics of conquistadors? No examples of conquistadors. Hernan Cortez, Francisco Pizarro, and conquering the Aztec and Inca respectively. You should certainly know like reasons why the conquistadors were successful. Of course, the diseases, but also superior weaponry and the use of horses. The conquistadors carrying out the same basic strategy that Spain had employed during the Reconquista on the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula when fighting Muslims. Black Death and the development in sea networks. Getting back to this question, this must have been what you were referring to, Mr. Andrew Steiner. And there was something I want to say about this. Somebody had asked a question earlier about the Silk Road and perhaps its greater effects, like on trade networks in the later period. We think about the Silk Road and for example, like Marco Polo and his writings, like they are inspirations. The trade that goes over the Silk Road and the amount of goods that start to be traded during its height with the Mongols especially really have Europeans starting to look eastward. Columbus saw Marco Polo as like this inspirational figure, and many other Europeans did as well, as kind of their inspiration to try to get to Europe. Now, how the Black Death helped with the development of sea networks, I would have to probably do more research myself to give what I think would be a satisfactory answer. But if I'm kind of using historical reasoning, I might expect that if communities in places like Kaffa on the Black Sea suffer from the Black Death, that people are going to start to look for other avenues of trade and trade through different regions. And so that might have played a factor in Europeans looking for another way to access the Americas as those trade networks fell into disrepair, maybe as a result of disease. I wish I could give you a more satisfactory answer to that. So apologies. What important Japan emperors do we need to know? No real emperors that you need to know until like the modern time period when we talk about Hirohito in our last unit of the year. But in this unit, Unit 4, when we talked about early modern Japan, we did a little bit of review. And in Unit 4, there's really kind of three guys that you need to know. The first, Nobunaga. He was the daimyo that begins using basically guns, weapons to centralize control of Japan. When he dies, Toyotomo Hideyoshi, takes over and continues that process of expansion, uniting most of Japan together. And when he dies, that's when we see the beginning of the Tokugawa shogunate. Tokugawa Ieyasu is the first shogun during that time. Now, there's kind of an emperor too, but remember the shogun is in charge, as that great History of Japan video tells us. Honestly, if you're out there watching this, if you watch the History of Japan video, it will better prepare you for the AP World exam. Language warning, though. All right. To what extent the Mongols and exchange networks influence the development of bubonic plague? I'm sensing a theme here. From this question regarding the DBQ, and I would say I don't know that DBQ specifically. So whatever documents you're being given are aimed at answering that question, and so I can't answer it any better without seeing those documents myself. I'm kind of intrigued by that idea of a DBQ. So you'll need to look maybe at what those documents are telling you. I always encourage my students, when you are answering a DBQ, each document is going to have an answer to the question. Whatever the prompt of the DBQ is, each document is going to answer it in its own way, and you will see commonalities between documents, and that's how you group them together. So if two documents seem to say that, I don't know, the Black Death led to a decline in trade on the Silk Road, then group those together, and that's one of your answers. And if the other documents are saying that the Black Death led to some other effect, group those together and think about those effects. Without seeing those documents, though, I don't think I can help you out any better. Question about I'm going to try to do rapid fire to the end here. Difference between the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates and their effects. Great question. So the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates are kind of our two major caliphates of I guess we consider it the post-classical era, 600 CE to 1450 CE. The Umayyads basically follow the Rashidun Caliphate, those rightly guided ones, and they come about, I think, around the year 650 or so, and maybe a little bit after that, 660, something like that. And they expand the Islamic Caliphate through North Africa into Spain, kind of out into Persia. They're very much concerned with having Arabs in charge of their army, right? So there's like, so these kind of Arab Muslims are, to be in the army, you have to be Arab. To be, to hold positions of government, the same thing. But they were also living kind of lives of luxury, and so a lot of people looked at the Umayyad Caliphate as misguided, and so they're overthrown by the Abbasids, which basically expand involvement beyond just Arabs in this kind of new Islamic empire. And so I would say, like, that's one of the big differences, like who was included. The Umayyads the Abbasids, the second one, starts in 1750, goes until 1258 when they're conquered by the Mongols. They have a much wider variety of cultural influences. It's not just Arab influences, it's Persian influences, eventually it's Turkish influences. The Abbasid Caliphate establishes a capital at Baghdad, which really becomes like the center of culture in the world, becomes like a major center of knowledge. It's kind of the heir to Alexandria in that sense. Again, ending kind of racial policies of the Umayyads. So like Arabs are no longer favored. It's much broader influence. And then the Abbasids continue that expansion of the caliphate into Central Asia. And while the Umayyads kind of stop being able to invade Europe because they're conquered at the battle and beaten at the Battle of Tours, the Abbasids meet the Tang dynasty at the Battle of Talas in Central Asia. They win the battle, which is actually why Islam takes hold in Central Asia. They also like steal like how to make paper from the Chinese, but nevertheless, they are eventually conquered by the Mongols. But after about a good 500-year run of that caliph, or the caliphs associated with the Abbasid dynasty, so to speak. Man, I love talking about that. That's as fast as I can go through. I think I've gotten through most of these questions. So if there's one more, maybe I will look at it. Let me see. So I think that's pretty much it. A lot of kind of back and forth between people on here. So that's, continue your conversations. And I will call that a night. I'll be back here on Tuesday for more specific exam questions. Hopefully I gave you some ideas of things to study. Of course, study tools that I always recommend. Freemanpedia, his one-pagers are fantastic. AP Worldopedia, if you read through that, you'll know everything from the key concepts. And the key concepts themselves, if you're wanting to create a study guide, go through those. If you search AP World History key concepts, you will find them online. And that's everything that can be asked on the AP World History exam. So if there's something in those that you don't know, look it up. That's a great study tool. That's it for me. Y'all have a great night.